Bard is in a very awkward place currently in Endwalker. Despite being in a decent spot in terms of the rating meta, you're going to be hard-pressed to find many people who say they enjoy it. Part of this is due to the job being the child of a very awkward marriage between Bard and Ranger. Said awkwardness is magnified by the history of iterations through the expansions that make the dev team look very indecisive about its direction. It went from to the infamously hated bow mage to being a job people actually liked to feeling completely outshone by Dancer at its core identity. Life has not been easy for Bard and its player base to say the least, though honestly, most people only get the job up to level 30 so they can stand in Limsa and act out their homeless musician fantasy. Is there any way we could improve upon this though? Given the job's history across the series, I definitely think we can draw some inspiration from its other iterations. Rather than just do a top-down rework like I did with the healers, I want to use this opportunity to give a bit of a history lesson on older Final Fantasy titles. For this video, I'm going to stick with mainline entries aside from 11 because I have no experience with that game. The Bard job made its first debut in Final Fantasy III and is obtained from the Water Crystal. We'll be referencing the Pixel Remaster version since the NES version of Bard is pretty terrible. This is less of a Bard-specific issue and more that the NES version of Final Fantasy III has bad job balance overall. In this game, the best way I can describe Bard is that it's something of a pseudo-support mage. It doesn't actually use MP, but the healing from their Paeon song scales off of Spirit. Bard's Spirit is actually on par with White Mages while trading some strength for extra agility. This is okay though since you'll rarely attack with a Bard and instead spam their support songs. The Pixel Remaster Bard can heal on par with Kira, then it learns a damage buff, a defense buff, and a song that inflicts a random status ailment. Each of these songs are learned every 10 job levels, capping off at 30. A unique feature to Bard's singing is that it will be performed as the first action of each turn. During the game, Bard excels in the mid-game with its free, high-priority Kira, allowing it to replace a White Mage. Towards the late game, however, the effectiveness of Paeon starts to fall off in combination due to its only okay base healing and Bard lacking equipment to significantly boost its Spirit. Additionally, bosses start hitting really hard to the point where Kiraga and Kiraja are far more desirable. At this point, Bard should be treated as a support job focused on boosting party performance rather than being a full-on healer. This doesn't stop it from being a fantastic job for making grinding easier though. Overall, Bard is a solid job that doesn't fail to impress in Final Fantasy III. The same thing can't be said for Edward in Final Fantasy IV, however. Oh Edward. Your greatest contribution to this game was a meme before memes were even called as such. Thankfully his Pixel Remaster incarnation is definitely more useful than his Super Nintendo debut where he truly did suck. Unlike Final Fantasy III, Edward's songs are purely based around inflicting status ailments on groups. This wouldn't be too bad if it wasn't completely random. He can also split a potion amongst the entire party, but this was removed from the American Super Nintendo release. Additionally, Edward can hide to avoid damage, but he also does this automatically when his HP gets too low. All of this led to Edward being a squishy character that did little damage and had unreliable abilities. The Pixel Remaster is much kinder to Edward though and takes him from being awful to decent. His songs are still random, but now he can at least split potions to provide some healing. Hide now also doesn't automatically trigger, so Edward won't instantly bail at low health. Maybe it's just me though, but Edward is very good at missing with basic attacks, which is a point of frustration. In general though, Edward still tends to feel outclassed the moment Rosa joins the party. In general, Final Fantasy IV is also just a very easy game, so it's hard to really find status ailments useful. Honestly though, I can't really fault Edward for falling short since everything is stacked against the guy's favor in this game. He's introduced after his kingdom is assaulted and his lover is killed, then being told to man up when he has every reason to grieve. After joining the group, he probably struggles to make a good impression in combat compared to the 7-year-old little girl in Cecil's party for the average player. Then after being in the party for maybe 2 or 3 hours, he gets exiled to being a bench warmer for the rest of the game. As a whole, Edward is more memorable for his personal storyline than his combat potential in Final Fantasy IV. Now Final Fantasy V is where Bard is actually a top tier job, especially if you've ever done a 4-job fiesta. Just like any spell in this game, Bard's songs are a form of collectible that you will need to find throughout the adventure, and I will be super biased here and say that I really like this method of progression for encouraging exploration. Just like in Final Fantasy III, Bard is a pseudo-mage job with its stats favoring magic despite none of its songs using MP. It also has above average speed, which lets it more quickly start singing to support the party. Compared to its previous version under the job system, this iteration of Bard trades healing power for much more overall utility. And like in Final Fantasy III, Bard is also unlocked from the third crystal you find in this game, in this case the Fire Crystal. Though instead of finding it after the initial explosion, it along with the Ranger Shard landed far away and were eaten by a chocobo. After that gross acquisition, you can begin collecting a few songs in the first world. While Mighty March is handy for granting a regen, the real gem is Romeo's Ballad for constantly applying stop to enemies. What makes this even better is that there are bosses you can stun lock. In the second world you can find Requiem, which is a nuke spell against undead enemies, making it fantastic for the dungeon you can acquire it before. In the third world, Bard rounds out its song list with the typical damage buffs along with their capstone song for playing every piano, Hero's Rhyme. This is unique because it increases the party's level, which is really powerful in Final Fantasy V since level manipulation is what can let you cheese certain bosses. And outside of this tremendous utility, Bard can hide to avoid damage just like Edward could. Overall, Final Fantasy V's Bard is an excellent support job with incredible potential over the course of your playthrough. Now skipping forward all the way to everyone's favorite entry in the franchise, Final Fantasy X-2. Yeah, I know people still get up in arms about the story of this game even 2 decades after its release.
That's nice. Oh!
But I will fight anyone that says this game doesn't have solid combat or a good rendition of the job system. I'm also counting it as part of the mainline entry since it gives me more material to work with on discussing job history. Moving on from that, X-2 took the sensible approach of combining the debuffing prowess of Dancer with Bard's buffing utility to give us a job that resembles a pop idol. Due to the job's lack of offensive and defensive options along with some abilities taking a while to learn, it's easy to sleep on its potential. However, if you do invest in it and find the 2 key items that unlock additional dances, Songstress can provide downright broken levels of support. The utility Songstress has includes putting enemies to sleep, freezing enemies in time, doubling the party's max HP, guaranteeing critical hits, stacking stat buffs like evasion of all things. And if you found those 2 key items, they can reduce MP cost to 0 or just negate magic damage completely. Just like the Bard from Final Fantasy V, Songstress is able to trivialize random encounters with Sleepy Shuffle and Breakdance to keep enemies stun-locked. It was great in 5, but here it's just unfair to the enemies because if they're immune to one, you can typically get them with the other. Stat-wise, the Songstress conforms to the same mold as her predecessors, favoring magic over physical combat and being a bit faster than a black or white mage. This is convenient for the early game where the job is at her least impressive and you can make use of the yellow ring from the first dungeon to have access to Thunder. Later on you can equip her with black, white, or Arcana lore to give her some offense, healing, or more debuffing options. Or if you want to meme, give her a strength boosting accessory along with sword or Bushido lore to bop enemies with a microphone. As a job, Songstress seems unimpressive at first but blossoms into a ridiculously effective support class. And this brings us to the 14th iteration of Bard, which combines music with archery, which I'm sure many still think is a weird choice. We can see elements Bard retains from its predecessors, like how its song rotation grants persistent buffs while also having other forms of musical utility. Though with each expansion, it feels like Bard has progressively shifted away from feeling like a bard and more like a very musical ranger. I think it's safe to say that one of Bard's biggest issues is that it feels completely non-committal to its class fantasy. Sure, it has musical buffs and some utility, but if you compare how many actions the job has dedicated to archery versus music, it makes you start to wonder why they haven't just converted the job to ranger at this point. Yes, they'd have to rework some of the more bard-esque weapons and artifact here, but these are the only musical weapons I found out of everything. A lot of these supposed harp bows more resemble fancy compound bows than anything as whimsical as an actual harp being used as a bow. This would be a huge band-aid to rip off and some assets may be lost in the process, but it's a sacrifice I personally would be willing to make. I know some people like the hybrid bow musician, but given the dev team's inconsistent direction with the job, I'm not optimistic about the job's future. Yes, it also means they'd have to rework aspects of the Bard story to fit Ranger, but I don't think that's a huge loss since I don't hear anyone talk about the Bard questline. And after the amount of work the dev team has put into reworking the old ARR dungeons, I think reshaping a questline I personally found forgettable wouldn't be too bad for making A Realm Reborn better in general. And to fill the void of the Bard songs, Rangers could summon animals like they can in Final Fantasy V. This will let the dev team cheat and reuse monster assets and help define the Ranger's utility while staying on brand. Additionally, the 4th physical range slot could be a completely reworked Bard that better conforms to the mold of its support-focused predecessors. And yes, all of these suggestions are just speculative fanfiction that I don't realistically expect to happen. I do however think that looking at other iterations of jobs in the Final Fantasy series is good for discussing how jobs can be improved to better convey their gameplay fantasy. Hopefully with the dev team's desire to fix the foundation of the game, we might see a better iteration of Bard in the future. I don't think the only option for Bard is to entirely scrap its current concept, but I did want to highlight how it wouldn't be too massive of an undertaking. It'd also be a way to implement Ranger into the game, which is a fairly iconic job in the Final Fantasy series itself. Or they could just reference the PvP version of Bard to make it more fun to play. Either way, I hope you guys enjoyed this little history lesson on how jobs played in other Final Fantasy games. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I hope you found this video insightful.